And, I've just been told that we don't have too much time because we are having an additional and unexpected screening, a second screening of the second film. So I'm just going to cut to the chase directly.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
The two films together, and I'm going to be discussing both the films together and presenting the questions to both of you together, right? So we can do this as a kind of freewheeling conversation. But the sense I had, Rohan and Mukul, with both the films is that they seem to inhabit a deliberate and striking ambivalence. Ambivalence towards architecture. Is architecture an idea, a space of concepts, or is architecture experience, everyday life? There seemed to be this kind of ambivalence towards architecture. And indeed, there was a kind of an ambivalence with regard to cinema itself. So I was wondering whether you guys could speak a bit to what is your sense of cinema? You use found footage alongside this wonderfully lush kind of cinematography that you do side by side. They're not quite juxtaposed. You don't seem to and yet you are trying to make a certain set of relationships between these things. So what is your sense of architecture? What is its place in our world today? And what is cinema?
So actually both films, in that sense, yeah, you're right, there is a relationship between them. Nostalgia for the Future really came out of a sort of unease that I had really concerning, I guess, architectural practice itself. And the sort of gaze that it inhabits, and the fact that it was always seen as a vehicle for development, and also the modern movement in many ways embraced the entire kind of architecture became one of the vehicles through which this modern Indian citizen was supposed to be shaped. And especially over the past few years, you've seen that entire mandate of the state disappear, but it's not necessarily being replaced by anything of any value. Right? And architects very often are kind of caught up in that sort of way in which they are very often kind of perpetuating much of the horrific kind of stuff that you're seeing around it without any sorts of ideas to whom they represent and what they intend to do. So that was vaguely it. And also as an architect, it was really thinking about the gaze that I inhabit as a middle class Indian and part of the professional elite within the country. And the gaze through which we imagine what our role is going to be and the citizens that we are supposed to be designing for, what is the form of that? Right? So, while Nostalgia for the Future was primarily interested in the let's say the conceptual idea of who this citizen was supposed to be, that was supposed to inhabit those spaces, with the lovely villa, we were really interested in looking at the actual inhabitation. Because when an architect draws, they are always imagining an ideal inhabitant, and in that sense, that ideal inhabitant very often haunts those drawings themselves as these sorts of apparitions of possible future lives. But of course, because I lived in a building that was designed by Charles Correa, I was really interested in looking at the memories of those the hauntings rather that continue to kind of that are so carefully choreographed by the nature of those spaces themselves. So in some way, really interested in the way that architecture is conceptualized and the way that it's lived, and the constant tension that lies between that kind of imagined order and the hauntings that tend to kind of disrupt that order. And I think both the films really are really interested in that relationship between architecture as this perfect grid with perfect people, and the fact that that can never really be, tangibly realized.
And about the film, I like to call Nostalgia for the Future as mid-career anxiety for the both of us. Rohan is an architect and an academic, and me as a filmmaker, cinematographer, and somebody who's been working in the documentary for most of my career. And why an anxiety? Because, if you're looking at the documentary, and we're sitting in Films Division here, which has been a vehicle of recording, of documenting the state's version of India's visual history for, a very, very long time. Not claiming to be anything else, claiming it to be the state's version, a subjective version of history, as history always is. And having engaged with that as before I got involved with film, and then later starting to work in the documentary with others as a cinematographer, as a filmmaker myself, where you begin to realize the gaze of the filmmaker. So, the kind of agency we give ourselves, let's say the kind of position we give ourselves as if the state is trying to, inform the citizen into becoming an ideal citizen through its agenda of the mass media, its agendas as propagated through the mass medias, whether it's a documentary, television, radio, whatever. And then later, so if it's a state saying you need to be a certain way, to be, in order to be ideal citizens of this nation, and then later in the 70s and later in the 80s onwards, when the independent documentary filmmaker comes in, and that continues, where the gaze, of course, remains similar, where you feel that if the state is trying to influence you to be in a certain way, later the independent filmmaker says, hey, but we have to protect you from the state, where the gaze remains a downward gaze, And that is something that I've always found, I've been part of making those images, and it's something that I've always found fascinating and interesting, and I must say, uncomfortable at times, where you give yourselves that position saying, okay, first the state says you have to be ideal, then we say you have to be protected because there are things wrong here. It's a meaningful position to take. It's your heart is in the right place. It's something you're trying to do, but something that you reflect on, and maybe it becomes something to be self-critical of. So nostalgia for the future comes from that kind of anxiety. Therefore, the language, which is the state's language of Hindi, a literary version of Hindi, and as was used in documentary films, produced by the state, Doordarshan, All India Radio, and the art cinema of the 60s and 70s, and so on. Then, of course, moving across all those different registers, textures, materials, whether it's celluloid film, archival footage, color, black and white, video, found footage, and so on. Continuing into nostalgia for the future, into Lovely Villa, where it gets even more intense. That entire disjunct, so to say, technically, that disjunct between our footage and footage which is ours, but comes from not very long ago, 15 years ago, but it looks like, the cinematography in me still says, I'm not supposed to be doing this, but there's a time signature on it. There's a time signature in those images, which are not very old, they're only 10 years old. But early cell phone images, and that shot of the Kanchenjunga building taken from a moving taxi as you're approaching it, or shots of Rohan's father. Extremely distorted, extremely pixelated and grainy. But 10 years ago is already a long time ago as far as that way of remembering is concerned. And those become experiences, for us to deal with time.
There is that sense of everything is already sepia toned. There is a sepia tone to everything, and that's interesting, because every time you mention engineer, it's in inverted commas. Every time you mention lawyer, it's inverted commas. Every time you say ideal home, it's inverted commas. And yet there is an investment. So there is in some sense, Mukul, when you say, images are already pinched by a certain sense of an irredeemable past. And, I'd love to come back to that if we have more time. But since there are a couple of other things that I also want to try and...
but I just interrupt and add one bit where Rohan says about this, it's like adding an Instagram filter where you're already sepia, saturated, desaturated, warm, cold, whatever, which has a certain meaning in terms of image history and experience of dealing with images. So.
Right. No, that's really, it in fact kind of even informs the second question that I wanted to pose to you, which is, on the one hand, the idea of architecture as a public vocation, as a practice that has to engages with modernity, engages with nation building, and so there is, as you say, the idea of the community. How do you build a nation? What is the idea of constructing a time and space for ourselves. But on the other hand, the experience of viewing these films, to me, it talks so much about the idea of architecture as refuge, as a space of solitude and reflection, as something where you move away and out of the public and retreat into a privacy that is really valuable. Yeah. So, is there a tension there?
Yeah, I think that was, I mean, I'm an architect. I love architecture, right? It's an incredibly beautiful act in the world. And it's incredible to kind of go to these places and feel that sense of retreat or intimacy. So, at some level, really, there's always this kind of complex question concerning identities, right? And the way that we are using architecture is not only a matter of the idea of intimacy or place or home or clothes. These are all things that we, in the first film, we call architecture as clothing, right? And
but then you also say architecture as mask.
As mask, right? So exactly that, right? So that's what I want to kind of say, is that there seems to be the way in which architecture tends to allow you to be yourself, so-called, okay, by the performance of an identity that you're not. And there's always a desire that is embedded within the act of architecture, right? So really the interest is in that desire, because desire is never, the desire is a sort of, let's say, a vector outwards, right? A kind of performative kind of idea. And architecture enables that, that move outwards. So I don't think that very often architecture is imagined in some sense as a refuge, but really I think that architecture is as much a refuge as much as it is a performance, a making of an identity. Right? And I felt like that really, this idea of architecture, that is the body of architecture, the architecture as clothing, architecture as a metaphor, as nation, as order, as structure, are actually all longings. They are longings that are then performed through the making of built form. And I think that longing haunts the building, the longing of who we want to become. If I'm being kind of clear enough, right? It seems as if those are the sorts of ghosts that we were really kind of exercising, if you want to call them that. The desire of architecture to make ourselves something else.
Mukul, those, in Nostalgia for the Future, the film is about a certain moment in our architectural history, but the film itself is bookended by these startling montage of faces. And so there is a sense in which, what is the meaning of that? I mean, there is the building, there is the built form. We'll come to this idea of the construction of the self, but clearly there are also people looking into your camera. What are they doing? Posing questions, expecting you to answer them, what do you expect of us looking at these faces?
Both ways. I mean, what do they expect of us and what do we expect of them? And that is the gaze that I was talking about. It is the empathetic outsider looking in at the other, and when you're trying to make these films, about people, about housing, about the dispossessed, about, citizens and so on, and that gaze that I was talking about, and very, very deliberately you can see that those shots are sometimes held a little too long for comfort. And if you were editing conventionally, you would make meaning of it, cut and move on. But sometimes they're held too long. You can see the shadow of the camera falling on people's bodies. The acknowledgement that they're looking at somebody behind the camera is made through those shots. In some sequences, like there's one shot which repeats of this boy looking at the camera, looks away, looks at again, and it comes at the beginning and the end of the film, which is shot in this village outside Chandigarh. It's almost as if we were shooting footage for somebody else's film, which would be a film about housing, about water problems, about sanitation problems, doing interviews where we're not doing interviews, but we're shooting as if we're doing an interview for somebody else's film. So we're referencing all these languages that are part of documentary making, news making, and so
and
on.
architecture making.
And
in fact, that last sequence where we go to Gurgaon, on the outskirts of Gurgaon, and we have these incredibly kind of, spectacularly dystopian images of high-rises and slums in the foreground, and we have all these children that are there, and it's a classic kind of documentary porn sort of image. And it's like, man, this is spectacular stuff. So what happened is that we started shooting it as that. These kids came and they started staring, and they're looking at us shoot them, right? And this is what we were shooting in color. And at one point, we said that it's a good point to start thinking about self-referencing, the act of the gaze of both the architect as well as the filmmaker. So then you see Mukul kind of immediately, we move to the footage where he's filling in 16mm film into his camera, and then he's shooting it. So to reference that act of kind of the construction of the other as the undeveloped, whom the developed, the middle class professional is going to in some way represent or resolve the issues of.
And again, that look at the camera, hopefully, yet in this confused kind of manner. Who are you? But you're looking at me, so I shall play along, and so on, which is, a trope that we all use while shooting documentary anyway. Where it's the classic shot where many documentaries might have ended on that shot of those black and white 16mm footage of those kids looking at the camera and at, the viewer. But we don't end there. We take it back to Bombay from Gurgaon, where this bunch of women, mainly women, is claiming a space that's not meant for them.
And
under
again,
a flyover.
There are 100 different ways of reading that image.
Yes.
And really that is, in that sense, the kind of ambivalence that I keep kind of thinking about. But in Lovely Villa, for instance, I mean, there's a startling shift of register, right?
Yeah.
You begin by looking at the genealogy of a practice, but then it becomes really, towards the middle of the film, about the construction of the self. Yeah. So okay, we were warned because the subtitle is Architecture as Autobiography, but in what ways is the making or the construction of the self similar at all? Or where is that kind of relationship you see between architecture and the self?
So, one of the things that, just as an idea, it's something that we were kind of playing around with, that what is architecture fundamentally? And it seems to that architecture is, in a sense, a way to kind of make sense of things. There's an architecture to the space, right? In that sense, it's a metaphor about finding the way in which one can understand the world. And at some level, really, that is really, because the film is also about, in that sense, finding who one is. The metaphor of architecture in the film tends to run through, again, different scales like it does in Nostalgia. At one level, it is the architecture of the building itself, but it's also architecture as order, and architecture as the grid, architecture as, if you want to call it, patriarchy in some way. And the fact that all these grids exist within which you kind of are trying to perform your life and discover your identity. And very often, it's a performed identity, like I was saying earlier. And architecture also enables that performance, enables you to become something that you want to be. Right? So that was really what we were kind of looking at, and especially because, both Charles Correa has been, just as an architect, he's been an extremely important sort of marker in terms of his work for me. But also my family itself and my background and the spaces themselves that were there. So I was looking at really what are the ways in which we tend to grow. What are the ways in which we tend to become who we are? And at what point does the grid itself that enabled that construction become restrictive and needs to be, in some senses, challenged or broken, or you move away from, which actually is where the Buster Keaton comes in.
Yeah, that's a brilliant kind of sequence, I thought, at the very end. Now, I am mindful of the number of people who are waiting outside, 70-odd people. So, if there are any questions from the audience, any responses, or...
I would just like to thank Asia Society, George, everybody, and Monica Correa, for being here for the screening. Sonal Sundarajan.
My
Sonal, where are
sister,
you?
somewhere, there she is.
Yeah, Sonal.
My mother's up there.
There's her voice in the film, Anita Auntie.
Who does some of the singing? Well, a lot of the singing.
It's her singing. There's Sabri Pandian. Sabri, where are you? Yeah, Sabri,
is there.
Assistant director.
And then there is John and Mary and Sham and Deepa, who are all posing for photographs in the film. Those really...
Yeah. The editor, Rikab
Before the
Desai,
smoke,
and sound designer, Madhu Apsara, are not here. So,
I think there's one quick question. Ashok?
Sorry, I didn't want. Maybe really quickly, for me, one of the ways around the question of ambiguity is to actually like something. And I'm wondering if you are saying unambiguously that you like what is a very complicated sort of definition, but you like modern architecture, right? It's a very sort
I
of
like architecture.
no, but
Yeah.
do you have nostalgia for the future? Is it your desire that sort of speaks, or that's the question, sort of, because different histories of modernism have been reappropriated. For example, a friend of ours wrote something called militant modernism, which is about the fact that yes, at that point you were making it for the state, but now you have these beautiful buildings which care about human dignity, and we should love them with a militant love for what at that point was purely like a state function of sorts.
Like
So
those
do you-
drums at the very
Right.
end.
So, and can you play the flyover instead of the drums? You know, it's a bit like, do we have love for the modern, or do you in this?
Yeah, I mean, that has actually been, so where does the name come from, Nostalgia for the Future, right? It seemed as if there was an imagination of the future, that there was this future that we were kind of collectively somehow kind of constructing, right? So the title itself is actually a longing for that imagined future, right? It seems as if we abandoned the future that was imagined by the Constitution in almost entirely over the past few years, and even more radically over the past 5 years. Right? So that was something that was very much part of what the film was about. It was really trying to kind of, in some senses, evoke again some of those imaginations of modernity that I think we feel have value and continue to have value today. The instruments through which that modernity was claimed may have been, in very often, completely flawed, and they have been also. But that doesn't mean that we need to abandon the project of modernity entirely and regress into some, medieval past. So yeah, there's definitely, the title itself comes from there, and the same goes even for the Lovely Villa film. Actually, it's an extraordinary place to live in. I grew up there. It's an extraordinary place. It was an incredible experiment by the state to create middle class housing for suburban Bombay, right? And the architecture is incredibly kind of generous in that sense. Even if you go there right now, it's extremely verdant, green. There are open spaces. It's an extraordinary place to live in. Yes, so I would say yes, there is a longing for that imagination, right? But there is also an acknowledgement of the fact that imagination came with many riders. And that is it's not as if we are outside. The reason why the film is anxious is that because we are participants in the making of that, right? And we understand the kind of problems that we have with our class position, our gender positions, who we are, the way that we imagine the other. Those are things that are coming with our own class positions that we can't escape. But but we have to kind of begin that kind of process of negotiating, and begin the process of acknowledging what is it that we really want, rather than, because it seems to me that very sense of the idealism, if you want to call it that exists in certain kinds of works that happened earlier, doesn't really exist that much anymore, and that really is maybe, and I belong to that generation that has discarded it, right? Because half of my life until about 1971, so 20 years literally within socialist India, and 20 something more than that now, within an era which actually is, I don't even know what we really represent anymore.
This is great line. I missed this is great.
Well,
That's because it is not entirely great, Yeah.
Yeah, all right. I think we are really struggling again, and with people waiting. So on that note, thank you very much, Rohan.
Thank you.
Mukul.
Thank you all.
Thank you for this.
For staying.
And thank you, Asia Society, for this wonderful screening. It was a great screening effort. Thank you.
Thank you.
Very much.